Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of Dubai.
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
With wonderful people all over this country. She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana.
So, viewers and listeners, welcome to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with Devin Batoon as our technical operator. As usual, we are having a discussion on interethnic relationship in Guyana. Tonight, we're discussing. Joining tonight, as usual, are very prominent stalwarts in Guyana. We have Veteran Ramarak, Ravi Dev, Vincent Alexander, and Professor Dr. Mani Nehusi. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, viewers, listeners. Again. If I may begin tonight with Professor Kimani Nehusi, who teaches this subject. Can you explain to us this whole concept of slavery, how it came about and why?
Thank you very much, Vishnu. I would rephrase your term. As I tell people, and I will continue to say, my ancestors were not slaves. They were enslaved Africans. And I think this is an extremely important issue because we have usually accepted the terminology of the people who oppressed us. And without recognizing it, we usually articulate their view of people and things in the world. Now, their intention was to de-Africanize African people, to make us less than human. They actually counted us with the horses and the cows and other animals and inanimate objects in the inventories of their plantations. We need not talk about the constant rapes, the mutilations, and so on. So it's clear that the people who enslaved African people wanted us not to be Africans. So they tried to strip us of our culture, our identity, because they knew that once our identity was substantially impaired or dissolved, we wouldn't be able to make the correct decisions for ourselves because we wouldn't know who we are, and therefore we wouldn't know what our real interests are. So to use the term slave is really to fulfill the objective of our enslavers. And I am very confident, Vishnu, that you don't wish to be doing that. So we need to say enslaved Africans, because in saying that, we show the force with which this condition was imposed upon African people. We recognize the constant struggle from the inception that African people put up. We include all the revolts and the revolutions, like in Berbice in 1763, like in Haiti in 1791 to 1804, in Zumbi in Brazil. Countless revolts and revolutions are recognized. And also, supremely, we recognize that African people who are enslaved is not non-people. We were Africans, and we're still Africans. So we were enslaved Africans. Our ancestors were enslaved Africans. So to talk about enslavement is to talk substantially about what Arabs did to African people and then what Europeans did to African people. But I want to address something before I go further. There are very many people who try to lessen and even disappear what happened to African people and its living consequences among us today by taking up various positions. One of those positions is an attempt to equate enslavement with indentureship, and I hope we spend some time addressing that tonight. Another one is saying that there was enslavement in all societies, and therefore the implication is what happened to African people is nothing strange or too difficult or some kind of diminishing of it. Nothing is further from the truth. There was enslavement in other societies, yes, but nothing compared to what Europeans did and Arabs before them did to African people. And one of the clear reasons for saying that is the continuing consequences of the enslavement of African people among African people today. And again, it's something that needs to be discussed. One last point here is that some people, including misguided Africans, sought to say that there was enslavement in Africa before Arabs and Europeans got there. Absolute rubbish. And it's dangerous rubbish. There were forms of bondage, but nothing approaching what Arabs and Europeans did to African people. And as somebody who is familiar not only with the social history of Africa, but with the languages, I could tell you that wherever you find a word that means something akin to enslavement in an African language, it doesn't mean that. What it usually means is a form of restriction. Usually the person isn't allowed to go back to their own country or people. You could start at ancient Egyptian, where, for example, Joseph was sold into enslavement. He was an Arab, sold into enslavement by his own people. What happens when he ends up in Kemet, ancient Egypt? He becomes the 2IC, the second most powerful person in the land, in the twinkling of an eye. Now compare that to what happens all around the world today. In this country, I'm in the United States now. A few years ago, a half-white guy was elected as president of this country, Barack Obama. White people did hell to prevent him from achieving his program. This is a representation of the racial hatred for African people that's still alive in these communities. And I contrast that to what happened to this guy in ancient Egypt, in the Bible, Joseph, because you see the dissimilarity of treatment. African people didn't do that to themselves and to other people.
Okay, so Professor Kimani does not like the term, or does not use the term slavery and slaves, but enslaved African people. So
hold on, one moment. It's not only that I don't like it. It's also because it's massively misleading. It's inaccurate and it's misleading. It's probably racist to use that term. And we need to educate each other about these things. So it's not only my personal position, it's a fact that you will come to a conclusion that is irrevocable once you acquaint yourself with the relevant facts.
Okay, so let's hear another professor, Dr. Betram Ramarak.
Well, the point about narrative is important, right? I think we all have to take that into consideration. And I think that the whole notion of the language we use is important. When we talk about indenture, which is what I am more familiar with, and I hope to make a few points about indenture today in terms of educating each other and folks who might be listening out there. And as I try to do always with these kinds of discussion is to try to relate it and try to make it relevant, to our situation in Guyana. So the historical past is important for us to acknowledge. And I think it's important, and I do agree what the good professor is saying about the narrative. I mean, historically, the history of Africans or Indians and so on who came under indenture were written by the Europeans, right? I think we have to play a very pivotal role in that history. We have to be part of telling that story because it is our story, whether it's being told from the experience of the African or from the experience of the Chinese or the Madeiran Portuguese or the Indians, right? Now, having said that, I know the topic today is about enslaved people. I don't want to use the word slavery, and indenture. So when we talk about indenture, and again, to try to kind of make this relevant to our situation here in Guyana, we have a current debate that is going on, right? Since a fifth generation member, I believe, from Gladstone, right? The Gladstone family who visited Guyana. So you've seen a lot of, if you're looking at the media, a lot of the rhetoric where, you know, people are saying, well, yeah, it's two different kind of system. You can't compare, but there are some similarities. What I will argue in the case of these two systems, is a couple of things. One is there is really a nexus, and we see that nexus especially with the Gladstone family. You know, the Scottish plantation owner who made his fortune from trading in corn and cotton in Brazil and the United States, right? He was the person who initiated, drawing from the experience of Mauritius, and this whole system of the inclusive indenture system was introduced into Guyana because of the Gladstones. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, there are some dissimilarities. You know, one was based on a contractual arrangement. You know, you could have renewed that contract and so on. But many scholars who have studied these two economic systems have agreed that indenture is a new system of slavery, to use a term coined by Joseph Beaumont, who referred to this as the new slavery, looking at the Chinese and the Indian experience. Hugh Tinker, the historian, has a book called A New System of Slavery. Rodney has used the concept of a new system of slavery. So there are some similarities, and I think when you look at those similarities in these two systems, right, the fact is, you're looking at the whole notion of coercion, control, right? The abuse that took place in the system, there are some similarities there. You're looking at the extraction of labor. In one case, it's the extraction of free labor. And in the other case, in terms of indenture, you're looking at, you know, the extraction of cheap labor. Of course, the whole notion of racism, stereotypes, you know, divide and conquer were all part and parcel of this whole notion of control, right? And of course, the one point that, you know, which people seems to ignore is that they are also, and this is the point Mr. Dev has made, is that there were Africans who came to Guyana. If we're going to separate the two systems, there were Africans who came to Guyana under the system of indenture. And I'm going to share some information from Clem Ciceron's book, Tiger and the Stars, where he said there were about 32,000 Madeirans, Portuguese, who came to Guyana as indentured. There were about 14,000 Africans who came to Guyana as indentured. There were about 13,000 plus Chinese who came, and there were about 381 Europeans who came to Guyana as indentured. So my point is, there is a nexus, but there's also a connection. And I think when people try to make that connection, or that, well, I'm sorry, when they try to make that disconnection, and this is the point I really want to make here with this summary, is that when they try to distinguish and put, you know, chattel slavery as a unique experience, which is what it is, and so is indenture, you're in a sense minimizing, you know, the effects of indenture and everything that came with indenture. But I think there's a broader point I need to make here when we talk about, you know, the experience of enslaved people, which is that it kind of leads people into a discussion which we have had in the 1980s, where the argument, and I think this is where the danger comes in, the argument has been made, and we have had this argument with people like Ras Michael and so on in Guyana, which is that A, Africans came here before the Indians, right? They suffered more, right? Therefore, because of prior arrival and because of extreme suffering, therefore, they deserve to have a greater share of the economic pie. And I'm going to cite one example where this argument still continues today. David Hines has said on one of his shows that reparations has to be provided by the Guyana state, implying that it is the current state. So to me, this becomes double dipping because you're now getting the Europeans off the hook. Or if you're getting reparations from the Europeans, you're now saying that the current state of Guyana, which should be distributing resources equitably, also has an obligation to provide reparations to Africans. And I think that is where that problem comes in, where we're now pushing an argument that will lead to conflict in Guyanese society, aside from the rhetoric that already exists. I mean, we've seen this. I know Vincent will disagree with me on this. The recent, missive from Roysdale Ford, who equates the current leadership, with the Europeans who control, enslaved society in that time. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I don't want to make this into a monologue. I'm sure there's a lot there we can discuss.
Let's go to Vincent Alexander if he wants to give any clarification, addition to the definition of enslaved people, or you prefer to use another term.
Certainly, what's clarification? Let me start off by responding to my disposition on the Rosedale Ford matter. Iteram may have seen my letter in today's papers, where I made no reference in terms of what I thought of what Rosedale said. I made no reference to that. But I saw another letter where I think proper reference was made. That was to say that one has to contextualize what Rosedale said from the standpoint not of a relational system, not from a relational system, but from the standpoint of a mindset. I think Rosedale, I would accept what Rosedale said if he's talking more about mindset rather than an economic or sociological context. So to clarify that, the whole, you have an issue here before us, which has a lot to do with perspective. There may be a particular phenomenon that people may come at from different perspectives. And because they come at it from a different perspective, they may arrive at different conclusions without the conclusions necessarily being invalid. All might be valid, taking into consideration the perspective from which they have looked at the matter. And I think that is what one has to take into consideration on this question of differentiation between, and I use the term slavery, and indentureship. I'll come back to that because I need to say that when one talks about slavery, that indeed slavery predated the discussion we're about to have about what is called chattel slavery. In the sense that in almost all societies, it became a norm that if one was indebted, could not pay the debt in the manner originally intended, that one submitted one's labor to the person to whom one would have been indebted. And that thing called slavery is like slaving for that person in repayment of the debt. And therefore, in that context, could have been time bound because it was an accepted norm in terms of how one repays, and once repayment is done, then one is relieved of that indebted status and no longer is in slavery. Similarly, you had a situation of prisoners of war, where when you had nations clashing, that those persons who became prisoners, it became necessary for their people, for them to contribute to themselves. It makes no sense to imprison someone and then to have to feed the person in a circumstance of communal and underdeveloped societies. And so those persons were made to care for themselves by virtue of laboring. As a prisoner of war, there was surplus, then that surplus belonged to the imprisoner rather than to the prisoner. And so one has to differentiate that state from what is referred to as chattel slavery, because chattel slavery has nothing to do with indebtedness or war among nations. It had to do with capture of people. And even in the instance where it may be argued that in some instances there were Africans who sold their brothers and sisters, by and large, that did not remove the element of capture. And even if those persons were previously in a bonded situation, those situations provided for coming out of it by virtue of labor. But when these persons were sold, they were sold into a system that didn't allow for them to come out of it by virtue of purchase. And so really it was a different regime. And so when one accepts that, comes to make a comparison between indentureship and quote-unquote slavery, chattel slavery, one has to recognize that from an economic perspective, these were completely different phenomena, completely different. And not only were they different from an economic perspective, but they were also different from a sociological perspective, because relationally they were also different. From a perspective of, in some regards, how they're treated, the humanity perspective, there would have been similarities. But any phenomenon has to be defined based on the essence of that phenomenon. And the essence of slavery, or enslavement if you want to call it that, in my humble opinion, different from the essence of indentureship. The indentureship, it is now argued that people were deceived, that there was an element of deception. There's no such thing in the case of the enslaved person. There's no deception. There was simply a brutal act of capture, coercion, imposition, and an act which does not provide for the normal course of things, a mechanism of being relieved of that status, all of which makes it different from indentureship. So I think that whilst one may argue from a particular perspective that both systems were exploitative, in that regard, you might argue, well, they're in the same category. The defining elements, the defining element was not simply the exploitation. The defining element was the relational element. It had to do with economic relationship, it had to do with the sociological relationship. And from that perspective, they are quite different. Though one can find commonalities, One of which is that they found themselves in opposition to the exploiter. And so that's an area of commonality, but it's not an area of commonality that coincided in terms of time as well. So really, any complete analysis may want to the conclusion that there is fundamental difference between slavery and indentureship, although one might find commonalities, but that those commonalities are not the essence, the fundamental of the relationship. They are, in some regards, what may be the peripheral elements of the relationship. You know, when you talk about law, you talk about terms and conditions. One is fundamental and one is kind of peripheral and supportive. That's the kind of differentiation I think that has to be made when one wants to speak about slavery, or one wants to speak about slavery as juxtaposed to indentureship. And the question of enslavement, I think that the use of the term enslavement is acceptable insofar as it was not an act of submission, and so they were enslaved. They weren't naturally slaves. In the instance of slavery prior to this chattel slavery, in many regards, there was an act of submission. When one was indebted, one literally submitted oneself to the system. And in the instance of a prisoner of war, it was accepted that this would be your status if you ended up on the losing end of the battle and became a prisoner.
Okay, so just one point. By relationship, you also mean they were property. They were owned by the slave owners, by the Europeans.
That's the relational element. That's the relational element, ownership. The other element may have been, indentureship may have been legal. It may have been caused by misrepresentation, which occurs in contractual relationships. But at the end of the day, the relationship was one that was supposedly premised on a legal contract, even though the contract might have been derived by misrepresentation and deception.
Yeah, and as property, they can be sold and also bought again. Yeah.
That too.
Yeah. So Ravidev, let's hear from you on those terms.
Well, we've only had 3 speakers yet, and we've passed half hour. So I think we may only have 2 cycles by the time when we're all done.
But they're good.
I want to tie together some of the elements that have been proposed by my fellow panelists. But before I do that, I want to again stress the perspective that I share, and I hope that my co-panelists share that perspective, which is that as human beings, we'll always look back to history, all of us, through time. But from each present problem space, the questions that are posed to us are somewhat different because of the exigencies of that present. So when one of our great intellects from the Caribbean, C.L.R. James, would have looked back at slavery and enslavement, he was talking within that problem space before decolonization, and he would have offered certain perspectives. So I want to pose that we in Guyana today, I would like to make this not just an academic exercise. Of course, it's good to be academic in terms of trying to have a handle on the facts, But I think we are engaged, or we should be engaged, in a discourse that addresses the exigencies of where we are in Guyana today. And those questions, we should seek some answers as we look backwards to that, because the past, as Faulkner said, is still there. It's not even past. You know, it still remains very rather stubborn, and we can go into details. So that's one perspective. The other perspective I would like to offer was mentioned by Beto in passing, and I would like to emphasize this. In the present Guyana that we are living in, I would like to pose that we need to craft a narrative, a common Guyanese narrative. A common Guyanese narrative, meaning that that narrative should encompass the past as seen by all of the peoples in Guyana. Obviously, there will be disagreements. As Vincent said, we may see certain things differently based on our own lived experience. That's fair enough. But if we, from the onset, always agree that we want to have agreement towards a common narrative where all of us can be included, and that narrative doesn't do injustice to us in any grave fashion, I think that we should go down that road. And in one of my interventions a week or so ago, I mentioned in passing one of the iterations of the same discourse that we had in the early 2000s, where Mr. Koyana intervened, and we were talking about the same notion of suffering. And Mr. Koyana said that he had been enlightened by Dr. Nicholson, and he would repeat what Dr. Nicholson had taken the stand back in the 40s, to wit, that why don't we say that we have all suffered equally, you know? And as I mentioned there, when I was asked to speak at the funeral of a good friend, Ronald Waddle, and I offered my eulogy to him, I made a statement that as we sat down when we were dragged here, and we sat down by the rivers of Demerara, we all cried as we remembered the Zion from which we had come. And the point I was making, that of course there are objective measures of suffering. Of course there are, we know that. But if we're going to craft a nation that can go forward positively, we have to agree on certain basics and not keep fighting the same fight again and again and again. Once it doesn't do, like I said, any great harm to any particular group. So with that as a background of where I am coming from, I would like to offer a perspective on much of what is said here. That what is unique about the slavery we are talking about in Guyana, the enslavement of African people who were dragged across the Atlantic and dumped here, and I want to, again, maybe focus on Guyana. The unique feature of it, I have stressed this again and again, remains with us stubbornly, with what one theorist has called as an aspect of coloniality. The colonialism that enslaved Africans and used them to start to build this thing called capitalism. It still remains stubbornly in our societies. The form may have changed, but the content has not. So while, again, the form might have changed from slavery into indentureship, when slavery was to be abolished, the argument, right, by Smith and others was that free labor would prove to be more efficient than enslaved labor. And as we know, labor is one of the only commodity that you can separate from the human being. Whether this was in ancient Greece, Rome, Africa, India, it doesn't matter where. This thing called labor can't be separated. So there will be always some forms of coercion. So when the fellas out in Berbice are striking and they were arrested because they behaved bad, they didn't get their severance, right? They are being coerced to provide their labor. It's on a continuum, right? The fact that, their hands couldn't be chopped off as you could do with enslaved Africans, obviously is very different from what this thing. So the key difference I feel that slavery or the enslavement of Africans brought into the modern world is this thing called racism, race and racism. And if we are to move out of this bind that we are in all across the world, we must always raise this nexus between enslavement, race, and racism, which persist to today. So, and this is the whole point, that when Africans were dragged out of Africa, by the 15th and 16th century, already Portugal and Spain had, for the first time in human history, tied the nature of man to physical characteristics. They call it limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood. They started with the Jews. They weren't pure enough to become converted Christians. They then, when they went into Africa to drag Africans into Europe before bringing them over here as slaves, people forget that Africans were dragged into Europe. And if you look at any of those old historic photos from the 16th century, you'll see them having little African boys and little African girls like pets in these Rembrandt photographs, pictures and so on. So by the time that they were now, quote unquote, discovered the New World, race was already a concept used to distinguish Africans and to make them and to declare that they were subhuman. And that then could justify these good Christians to treat another set of human beings for the first time in history, not, as Vincent said, because they were captured, not because they couldn't pay debts, not because of any other reason. The only reason was that you're black. As Fanon said, right? He talked about the body schema, the pigmentation schema, the epidermal schema, black like me, right? Once you were black, you were not human and you could be enslaved. And there was nothing wrong in chopping off your hand or even cutting your neck or hanging you on a pike. And I think this is the point. I think somehow people get uncomfortable about discussing that, because this notion is not just, and in Guyana we argue as if Indians invented this to insult black people and all that. This was there before even Africans were brought here. So this is why I always say that. You can go to South Korea, you could go to China, you could go to the Ukraine, when those poor African students couldn't even get on to a goddamn train to get out of Ukraine into Poland. Why? They didn't go through all of this with blacks being slaves in these places, but they have gone through in their mind that people with this coloration and this kind of hair are subhuman. And this is something that we got to grapple with. Because when the British turned their attention and broadened it, all of Europe, not only the British, but we're talking our history, and went to India, right, and started to intrude in India. From 1767, they conquered South India. By 1857, North India. They could apply the same concept of race. So if you look at the British writings, Indians were also called niggers in the British system. Only when they were brought to Guyana to substitute for African free labor that they exhorted, they were called coolies, which is a word to people who provided labor. But within India, they were niggers, right? And you have in India a lot of people who felt pleased with a pat on their head. Well, you're not quite African. So they, as I always said, Cornel West educated me to this, that the Christians, the good Christians with their books, created out of that good Bible that is universalized, to say because some people, some sons of Noah, Ham, looked at their father and saw him naked. They suffered sins, and those sons of Ham, I don't know how they actually did it, are those Africans who are dark-skinned, and therefore biblically they could justify it. And up to 1978, the Church of Latter-day Saints in America, when I went there, I was still in America going to school, and they still had that as part of their doctrine. And they're now in Guyana running around and getting black people to go to their churches in Guyana here. In Guyana right here now. So I want to just bring this to head that we are in Guyana. And Vincent was being kind to talk about, Roysdale talking about a mindset and all that. Let me not kid ourselves. That mindset is a given across this world. I lived in America. I worked in America. I rose up the corporate ladder. And I could see how an African who had been born in America, who had slaved for America, who had helped build America, was treated. You understand? Again, I want to say, therefore, in Guyana here, this common narrative must now include the fact, let us not argue about slavery versus indentureship. They are both forms of labor. And like I said, even though they promised free labor, they were cruel enough right before slavery was even finished to say, oh, okay, buddy, you're not actually free. You'll come for 5 years and you're bound to this estate. So in Iflot, I'm doing a history of my village. So from the nigger yard, we were put into the nigger yard, which is right next to the factory at Iflot here. And when we filled up the nigger yard, because from those nigger yards, some of our African enslaved people who were then free bought what is called the village of Iflot near the public road. Then we had the bunk quarters next to nigger yard. And then we had, others. The point is, I want to conclude. I know I'm going on, but I'm just trying to match my fellow panelists by being rather prolix, right? I don't want, as Vincent taught me a word today that is African in its origin, I don't want to be a kunumunu, I got to be bold. So I want to conclude like this, very seriously, gentlemen, and all of you who are listening to me, and I hope I'm speaking to some Guyanese, to say, listen, let me stop this squabbling about little bits and pieces and look at the big picture. We're all in this. I always tell the story when the first oil conference was held at the Marriott. I always tell this story. I was there sitting at a table in the Marriott having lunch with my kids. My daughter was Queens, top common entrance, top CSEC, head prefect of Queens, top all of Guyana. You get me? Top the Caribbean. doing medicine, top the medical school, a GPA of 3.5. And this Texan redneck down the table, 2 tables down, is asking his friend next to them, he wonders if we speak English. He wonders if we could speak English. This is my country. They come into my country. So things ain't changed. So whether they look at us as Africans and say whatever the view of African, they don't see Indians much different, my friend, especially a black skin Indian like Ravi there. You understand? So let me quit this, sniping, and we ain't getting nowhere, because we can be headed for a new form of slavery, apart from the one Tinker spoke about in 1974. Thank you, gentlemen. I think I have done justice to the time allocated to me.
Oh, yeah. No, but
Self-allocation.
informative as well, very educational. Kimani, you want to add?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. A couple of things before I go into addressing some things that I think must be addressed. Ravi, I agree with you that we need to have a common narrative. And in fact, I elaborated that in my book, A People's Political History of Guyana. And I think it's important that we join together in this. I think we need to get to a position where we're comfortable discussing things. And I think this panel suggests that. But there are still significant differences.
Of course.
And I think we need to educate each other some more. And what I would hope
You see, I'm afraid of just scoring points. And
I'm not here to do that.
That's exactly. So that's all I'm
not
saying.
here to score points.
I don't think I think you're serious. Sorry.
Well, I think that one of the things this discussion seemed to lack is a knowledge of the world before European intervention. And I think that because we don't understand what the world was before European intervention, we're prone to accepting European definitions of our reality. And our use of the term slave is a good example. And I disagree with Vincent. I know you talked about social relations, and I had written it down to say to you that that's decisive. You see, the results of actions are different in different circumstances. And when you talk about what you call slavery in different societies, people being captured in war or people having to repay a debt, the social relations of those people was decisively different from what would happen to enslaved African people. So
but he made that point, huh? He did make that point as well.
Well, so what he's doing is calling two different things by the same name. If you pour some water into an empty XM rum bottle, it's still got the label XM rum. That doesn't make it XM. It's water. It's different. And we've got to call a thing by its name. We must stop the European misrepresentation of our reality by accepting, without interrogation, European definitions of those reality. And there is nothing that I could reject more strongly than this notion that we have what you call slavery in Africa before Arabs and Europeans got there. I gave a couple examples. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but let me give you this one more. King Jaja of Opobo, by European definition, was supposed to be an enslaved African. He was the leader of his community. He was the richest man in the region. And the Europeans were so jealous, the British, that they found means to try to chop him down. Is that enslavement? Especially how the Europeans treated us? We cannot go on confusing different things and calling them by the same name, especially in the service of the narrative of our oppressors. The next point I want to address is Betaram's notion of reparations. I think we need to understand what reparations is. And one of the most important things about reparations is to ask reparations for what? And this is where the true horror of enslavement has not registered with most people, who seem to equate reparations with an easy way of getting money from white people. Now, the trauma, the psychological trauma of enslavement is still in many African people. The diseases like heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and so on, they're still with us. They came directly from that. The lack of intergenerational wealth, in other words, poverty, that came directly from that is still with us. And I want to make some comparisons with other races who were brought to Guyana. And I'm not going to do this because I want to say, y'all had it better than we and that kind of stupid argument. I think Guyanese people need to educate ourselves about our own history, similarities as well as differences. And it's no good thing hiding, whether we meant to or not, anything. We need to understand what happened. And let me just say that this notion of equality is a frightening one. We should talk about equity. And when African Guyanese say that the state should allocate more resources to addressing the problems of African people, I think that's a human response to African people. Because our presence in Guyana didn't come about by accident. And as most people recognize, we African people suffered the most and the longest. Let me just say that the interference with our identity, the fact that we still think of ourselves as Christians, meaning trying to become Europeans, is one of the gravest injuries that we suffer from. We don't know who we are. And I could go on and on about that. But we need to interrogate that and recognize how that has held back African Guyanese development. Think also about this, that the state in Guyana inherited both the assets as well as the liabilities of the succeeding states, meaning the colonial state. And it is the duty, the job of a state to support any of its citizens who need the support. And in this case, we're talking about resources to African Guyanese people who have suffered and continue to suffer from the experience of enslavement. Now, you cannot say that treating African Guyanese the same as you treat any other group of people in terms of the resources you distribute to them would be a good thing to do, because you're not treating like and like. And we have already the example of indigenous Americans, the indigenous people who've been given lands and so on in acknowledgement of the greater injustices that have been done to them. And I'm not advocating this on any unseen or misunderstood basis. I want all of us to understand the importance, the justification of this. So let me say a couple of other things. We should go for equity and not equality. If all of us on this panel are in a race, let's say a 100-meter race, and somebody holds back Ravi Dev, and the rest of us start running, and then after 5 seconds, we say, Ravi, go. Ravi is permanently impaired in terms of winning that race. And no attempt at justifying my action or whoever held back Ravi could amount to the fact that he was pained, he didn't win the race, he wasn't treated equally. In terms of a large group of people, we may not be able to lift every single aspect of that example I gave and bring it to bear. But what I'm saying is that a state should recognize that this group of people here, they're suffering from historical injustices. We have to do something about it. How that state does it is a matter for debate. I certainly don't support the state of Guyana saying that we got to give half our budget to African people. That's madness. But you have to find ways of doing that without impairing the interests of other groups of Guyanese. That's where I would leave that one. But I want to emphasize a couple of ways, or more than a couple of ways, in which African Guyanese have been at the shorter end of the stick. It's not just a question of enslavement and the cruelties, physical cruelties of enslavement. The mental traumas of enslavement are still with us. Even European psychologists acknowledge that trauma is something inherited and passed down from generation to generation. Well, you know, a few years ago, when Arabs were capturing Westerners in the Middle East, when they were released, Westerners, they were taken to Germany and given treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome. African people had that kind of, more than that, for hundreds of years. Could you tell me where any state has intervened to deliver that post-traumatic disorder syndrome treatment in that for us? Secondly, the question of land in Guyana is very important, and it's topical because part of the discussion is Indian people taking over African people land. This is to put it in a graphic way. To the extent that that is true, I don't know. I know I'm suffering from it. What I do know is that there's a feeling there, and it's important for us to put that on the table and try to find out what is the situation. What I do know, though, is that African people were at the short end of the stick in terms of land distribution in Guyana. We, African Guyanese, bought exhausted lands at inflated prices to make the villages. What's the experience of Indian Guyanese? Well, Indian Guyanese were given land near to the estates. Why? Because planters realized we want these people to work on the estate. We give them land. There are also a number of government schemes, Broke Pot, places like Hoostideren, 9 or 10 different schemes where land was prepared and given to Indian people. Now, I'm not telling you that the colonial government was wrong to do this. It fits into my narrative that a government's duty is to give resources to the people who need it. All I'm saying is that there's a differentiation between the experience of African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese in this specific instance of land distribution. At various intervals, African Guyanese asked for land, demanded land. We were never given it. Never. In terms of the Sugar Estate Welfare Fund Committee, it was a good thing. Indian people were given land to build houses, house lot, $1 or $5, very cheap. That's good. But where was the equal treatment meted out to African Guyanese? I'm telling you this because there are people in Guyana who's got a narrative that says African Guyanese are in the position we're in vis-a-vis other Guyanese because we just can't do it. We're lazy. Something's wrong with us. And there are Africans who believe that nonsense. And it's because we do not understand. We don't know what transpired. Let's look at taxes. From the inception of what is called the legal termination of physical enslavement, so-called emancipation, the tax system was shifted to focus upon African Guyanese. We bore the brunt of taxation. Taxation itself was socialized, if you want, but the disbursement of the taxes was privatized. Most of it went to the estates. The villages were run down by 1865. Do we know this? I talked at least on this program, and I think Ravi talked about it too, that if you had a donkey, you had to pay tax. You had a donkey cart, you had to pay tax. Who were these taxes aimed at? Who were the people who suffered from those taxes? Also, we should pay attention to what happened in the retail trade. That was a retail trade that was set up by African Guyanese. And through a number of different things, the colonial state, white people, pushed African Guyanese out of the retail trade and handed it to Portuguese, who had come as indentured laborers to Guyana. And many of them didn't spend a day doing the indenture. And I want us to try to understand all of that and look particularly at the results, the effects of all of those actions coming together and how they have affected African Guyanese people from generation to generation, how they have affected Portuguese people from generation to generation, how they've affected Indian Guyanese from generation to generation. And effect here doesn't only mean negative, it means positive also. And I want us to look upon the destruction of African Guyanese families under enslavement and to find out if we've ever had any kind of treatment that tells African Guyanese, this is where you're coming from. This is what happened to you on the estates. This is what could happen to restore you to yourself. It's only some people are doing this, especially in the United States. No government, including the colonial government, one moment, including the colonial government that was run by African Guyanese predominantly, has ever attempted to do this. And it's an important point to make. So we have a lot of work to do first to understand ourselves, and secondly, to advance programs, intelligent programs to repair the damage. That's reparations. Stop there.
Okay. Ramarak?
Well, you know, there is plenty to respond to here, and I have to say I'm a little bit worked up because I feel like, you know, a lot of this burden is now going to be shouldered on the people who are part of the system today. And I repeat what I said, but before I do that, I want to see if I can respond in a way that will share the narrative, you know, that I am more familiar with, the indentureship narrative. But the one thing I would say offhand is I wish we could have more Indians, more Portuguese, more Chinese folks like Vincent and the good professor who, you know, has spent years studying, you know, the history of their people so they can articulate that vision. And I am very impressed by the way you have done it here. You are speaking your truth, you are speaking your narrative, and I think that is very important. We started off this program by talking about the fact that we have to take control of the narrative, right? Because we are part of that history. But I want to share something before I get to the main points that I want to make. And I can't, like I said, I can't respond to everything here today. There is a famous, it's not a story, it's a real life situation, and it's based on a book called Maharani's Misery. This was a book about an indentured woman who came from India on a ship called the SS Alan Shah. Now, this woman was raped several times on the ship by the crew members, and there were several trials. And this story was documented by a professor from Jamaica known as Rerun Shepherd, right? And again, it's a true story. It's out there. It's available on Amazon. Rerun Shepherd is in charge of the Reparations Commission in Jamaica. And when you look at the the points that the reparation, and I know the professor mentioned reparations. There are 10 points that were proposed in this CARICOM reparation commission, which we do support. We have no issues with any of them. But there are 3 of them where when we talk about, having a common narrative and sharing our lived experiences so we can move to that level of commonality, I would say there are 3 of those 10 points that are crucial and where we have some similarities, where we can actually have a real discussion. Aside from the others, we have no problem with reparations, whatever form that take and whatever. Point number 5 in that 10-point commission refers to the fact that Africans are calling for assistance in remedying the public health system. Now, let me tell you something about the public health system. There have been documented studies in Fiji, for instance, by a professor named Brijlal, who spent years living in the archive, and he has shown that suicides among Indians who live in the diasporic communities like Fiji, and I'm sure the same would apply to Guyana, Trinidad, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Jamaica, and so on, where Indians have come to. It is higher among them than it is in India. So there is a causal relationship there. Secondly, a major problem within the Indian community, which we can trace to indenture, is this whole question of alcohol abuse, which is a tremendous problem among Indians. And I can tell you from and again, this is just anecdotal evidence when it comes to suicide. I'm seeing situations where people are not just hanging themselves, but they are taking the lives of their loved ones before they take their own lives. It's a different level of suicide. So if we're talking about post-traumatic stress, those are 2 of them. And here's a third one, which I think research can show. The whole question of, I think I mentioned alcohol abuse. We know the whole question about, in my village, we used to talk about this thing called bushrum, and I think everybody on this panel know what it is, right? Then there's that question about spousal abuse, which is a major issue among Indians. And I would argue that all of those traumas among the Indian community can be traced to that indenture period. So what I'm saying here is that, yes, if we're looking at having a common narrative, these are issues that if we are having that discussion here today, that Indian voice, just the way the professor is presenting that African narrative, that Indian narrative has to be out there. And my fear is that it is not. And I tell a story about Maharani, not necessarily because that story is common, but that's an example of the trauma and the abuse that took place before the indentured crossed the Kalapani and braved the Hoogleys, that they were afraid of. And I will tell you something else about indenture, which I think people missed this point about indenture. Guyana is the only place, as far as I have seen, the only place where Indians have gone to where there have been more uprising, what the Europeans would call riots, more uprising against the estate and the plantation owners. The most brutal, or one of the most brutal, was in 1913 in my county of Berbice, in the Rosal estate, where 15 people were killed, and there were some people who suffered injury, but they could not fix them. They had to amputate, right? So what am I saying here? I'm saying, one, if the argument is being made that the current state has to provide reparations to Africans, my point is that is a contentious argument you're making, because as I said before, you're leaving the Europeans off the hook. And I think that argument has to be made with them. Now, we can talk about equity. We're living in an oil and gas economy, but we can talk about equity as another form of distributing the wealth that the current state has. The current state is not the same state as the European state that control the plantocracy. It's as a different state. We're dealing with different laws, a different setup, right? We're independent and so on. it is a totally different state. So if the argument is being made about taking reparations from, as I said, David Hines is arguing, that is going to be problematic because it is not going to lead us to a common narrative. It is going to lead us into a more divisive narrative where it's not going to figure well in terms of this whole notion of having a one, a Guyana society that we're all hoping and striving for. Yes, I know Vincent is smiling. There are problems, and we've talked about some of those things. One of my issue today is that the one Guyana is asking non-Africans to sacrifice for this whole notion of one Guyana. Because here's an example. Kimani is talking about, okay, the African problems and all the issues that are connected to land distribution and so on. Yeah. Hughes Darien was an Esquimalt, but that was a failed attempt to create an Indian settlement. The first one was actually Helena. But that land settlement, obviously you're correct, it was to provide a pool of workers. But the Indians had to work on that land, they had to pay tax, they had to develop the land. And over the years, Indians have, experienced something called, they've sacrificed, their standard of living, deprive, whatever that economic term is, delayed gratification, and they have invested. So now what I'm seeing right now is a situation where we are seeing that the current argument about reparations is in a sense heading in a direction where those people who manage the current state are being asked to shovel out or dish out more to people who claim that they suffered more, right? They've invested more, and they came here long before, and they moved 1 million tons of dati, right, to lift us above sea level. And what I'm saying again, that is a problem. I see that as being a problem. So I'm going to conclude by saying this. The narrative we speak, it has to be legitimate, and it has to be coming from the people who share those lived experiences, to use a word that Vincent has used. And I think by doing that, I want to come back to the next 2 points that the Reparations Commission has mentioned, which is point number 6 about education programs. I think we can all benefit from that. When we talk about the diaspora and people who suffered over the years, that equation somehow has to find a place. Sadly, as I said before, we don't have the caliber of social scientists who understands that that history of Indians to have that fair discussion and bring that to the fore, right? And point number 6, where we don't have a problem, but I think there's some commonality here. Point number 7, which refers to the enhancement of historical and cultural knowledge exchanges. That's crucial, whether it's about exchanging cultural knowledge between folks living in Guyana and Africa. It should also apply to people, who are Portuguese, who would like to have that experience, or Chinese or Indians. And I think those would be, what political scientists would call, low intensity areas where we can actually find common ground to work together and cooperate. But again, I want to end by saying that this argument, the way it's going, it seems to me, and maybe I need to be educated on this, it seems to me that it's putting primarily Indians, when we talk about the rich Indians and those who have business and so on, it seems to me that it's putting those people in the line of fire. And I want to remind everyone here about what George Lamming said. It is the hands of Indians that actually fed these societies, right? He talked about them being thrifty, talked about them being, industrious. And I would end by asking this question. If we're talking about all of these things that Africans were wronged over the years, how the heck do we explain what happened between independence 1966 and 1992? Why wasn't some of these issues addressed then? I will leave it at that.
Vincent, we only have 10 minutes. I hope you will give Ravi an opportunity.
I hope I have an opportunity to say 2 words too.
Yes, I will give you.
I'm just getting a little worked up, so I'm just,
First of all, I want to say that For all intents and purposes, language is the custodian of culture, so that one could see from language what in fact is. And one may take the argument about slavery versus enslavement into that context. But you know, when I read the newspaper these days, I'm always careful not to end at the caption. Because ever so often, the caption does not in fact reflect the content of the article. And so, for me, I am not caught up so much with the expression that says slavery or enslavement, because those expressions are not in themselves definitions. They may have definitions, but when one uses them, they're not in themselves definitions. And so I'm always more concerned about content. And so even as I dismiss slavery and enslavement and things like that, I am concerned about what do we actually follow through with when we're talking about those things. And one could see that there's no cohesion sometimes between the terminology used and what is actually being spoken about. And I'm more concerned about the content and the reality than the terminology. Because sometimes the terminology can take us off into passionate and emotional interactions that really don't represent the reality we want to talk about. So that's the first point I want to make. I could live with enslavement, but for me, content is more important than terms, which in the narrative are not in themselves a definition. Except that one may argue, well, we have definitions that are forming the use of the term. The second point I want to make is that, you know, I have written in the 80s, there were two things I wrote about. I talked about the pedagogy of mutual respect, calling for that. Because if one is going to cultivate a common narrative, it has to be facts-based. And for things to be facts-based, we first of all have to accept what the facts are, rather than interpretations and of history. So I think we have to get to the point where if we're going to have a common narrative, that we first of all, without prejudice, speak to the facts and the lived experiences of the various groups. And it's that which must inform that common narrative. That which must find itself in the pedagogy of mutual respect. So when we speak to each other, we speak with each other, we speak with a clear factual knowledge and hopefully understanding of the experiences of each other. And that has to be the base upon which any common narrative is built. And so we have to be able to have a respectful diversity. Diversity sometimes which will speak to experiences that sometimes have caused the rift. Experiences which have caused the rift. Because when we speak about reparations, I differentiate what I call external reparations from internal reparations. For this reason, that I speak to external reparations largely in relation to the pre-emancipation period. They speak to internal reparations post-emancipation. Because in the post-emancipation period, there are things, institutions, and legal frameworks that were constructed during the pre-emancipation period, which were taken up by the post-emancipation state and taken forward. You may well argue that in that post-emancipation state, these institutions, as these frameworks, affected all the groups. But it may also be argued that there were peculiarities and specificities that can be related to the specific groups. And that in the differentiation sometimes, notwithstanding the argument about all the groups having suffered and coloniality, that there were structures of hierarchy and so forth that ought to be interrogated to understand which group is where based on the historical lived experience. And so, for example, one may look to the argument about what the taxes did. One may look to the argument about what the license for trading did. As much as one may look to the argument in relation to what the plantation may have done to the estates may have done to people of Indian descent. And so in the talk about reparation, I reduce it very often to equitable treatment. And in the context of equitable treatment, to argue that yes, different groups are confronted by different problems based on the evolution of the society that they live in and how that society is related to them. And therefore, equity has to meet out to different groups in the area where they require equity. That dismisses this notion of coming to equality immediately, because there's need for equitable treatment in relation to the problems confronted by the various groups. And when one talks about reparations, for me, internal reparations, talking about that equitable system, which does not interfere with other groups requiring equity in the areas in which they are affected, because we are not equally necessarily and commonly affected. And so, without going to the question of magnitude, if one were able to identify the areas where groups are affected and apply equity to those areas, then that is the way in which the problem can be confronted. Because even in the context of race and the context of coloniality, we weren't all necessarily treated the same way. We haven't all necessarily suffered the same way. We haven't all necessarily suffered in the same spheres of suffering. And therefore, we have to disaggregate and deal with those things, even as we look at the commonalities. But the disaggregated areas that require equitable treatment also and have fundamentally got to be dealt with. And so in that regard, you don't dismiss anybody's concerns, but you have to, in many regards, particularize those concerns and be responsive to those concerns, particularize those experiences and be responsive to those experiences. And if one wants to speak from the African Guyanese perspective of reparation, I would argue, and I'm speaking from the African Guyanese perspective, which is not to negate anybody else's perspective, that there are institutions that even up to today are still extant, that have followed on the historical institutions that affect the people of African descent and ought to be addressed. That any talk about equality and not seeking to address peculiarities is to maintain, in many regards, what existed before. And so, yes, I speak from the African perspective. There are those who speak from the Indian perspective. What we have to do through mutual respect is to understand those different perspectives, understand the different remedies that are required, and as a nation, collectively attend to the different perspectives and the different remedies. And there is where the state has a responsibility. And my contention is that the state, and more particularly the government at this time, does not accept that historical evolution that has brought us to where we are still diverse in ways in which there is need for equitable treatment to address the diversity, even as we accept that there will be diversity that is unrelated to that evolution and which has to be accepted as natural and become a part of the kaleidoscope, where the level of the individual, the family, the community, diversity is accepted. And diversity, in some regards, unrelated to what has been engineered by the colonial state, what has its origin in the pre-emancipation period. And if we see the society from that perspective, then we have the basis upon which we can have a conversation that seeks to address the issues of the various groups, even as it addresses the national issues, and in that way provide a solution for the unacceptable elements of our plurality and for the existence of a state that undulates based on who's in control of the state. And the state sometimes that doesn't even undulate, it just continues along the way of the institutions that were established and that continue to dominate our existence. So, for example, when one looks at an institution like NIS, one sees that here's an institution that addresses the people at large, because they're affected equally in that regard. But then there are other areas in which they're not affected equally. Therefore, you need institutional responses to those areas so that we are able, I conclude, to deal with our diversity, to have a political system that is responsive to our historical evolution, the diversity that still remains, that is not natural diversity, but diversity in some regards engineered, and to recognize that the differences we have that are a product of the evolution of this society are not only material differences, but psychological differences. That even as we seek to resolve the material differences, we have to recognize the different psychological states, which also have to be attended to, even as they are respected.
Ravi, it's 9:04. I don't know how much time you need, but Kimani also wants a minute, so I'll leave it up to you.
Well, you got to stick to a format, and we just can't keep going all over the place. So I'm going to use my time based on what has been used before to respond to some assertions made. I return to the fact that we need to have a national narrative. Now, as Vincent said, we may have different opinions, but we have to agree on some basic facts. One of those facts, for example, is about land and land distribution. After the so-called emancipation, Africans on their own used their hours after they finished the work they had to do during the so-called apprenticeship, they worked extra hours, saved that money, and they invested in buying plantations, or in some cases, like my village of Iflat and next door Stewartville, they bought plots of land where they built houses, right? Proprietary villages, they're called. They didn't buy the rest of the plantation, just some lots. The point about those lots being sold at exorbitant rates, that can be questioned. We know sales of property, there's a market price, and we can go by the market price. Because of the fears of the planter class, that which became a self-fulfilling prophecy, that liberated Africans would not work. I don't think it should have been a surprise. Why should they return to the source of all that brutal violence and humiliation? Be as it may, there was a bust in the price of plantations. And so they were sold for what was called at fire sale prices. That's a fact of what was that. So in terms of what was exorbitant, that is arguable. The point is, though, it was a heroic move that came out of their lived experience, that they were going to be independent of the plantation. You understand? And they made choices. And one of those choices was to buy those lands, and buy those lands based on their own criteria. We know to their cost that some of those lands, take Buxton, for example, into the 21st century, Buxton has a drainage problem, right? Which was always going to be difficult, even if the planters had not cut canals and done all kinds of things, which they did do. It was going to be a difficult proposition. So, but Africans bought land, and they made strategic choices as to what they could cultivate. So, for example, unlike certain Caribbean islands, I think it's St. Vincent that chose arrowroot. We chose ground provisions. In Guyana, we wanted to be independent and make our own living. So the strategic choice of African Guyanese on the crops they would utilize on those plantations was their choice. It is a fact of history that African who escaped the plantation, they were called Maroons, cultivated rice, because many of them from certain parts of West Africa had their method of rice cultivation, which in fact gave rise to the Carolinas in America. But in Guyana, even though that rice was cultivated by Africans who escaped the plantations, and there's records of it. In one case, there's a famous quote that there was enough rice stored that could feed 700 people for a year. A lot of rice. But the Africans who bought those lands did not choose rice, for instance, to cultivate, which would have been a commercial crop. That's a strategic choice they made. And we must consider that, as to that is one factor in the grand scheme of things in terms of what was successful and what is not. So coming back to the land, and Kimani repeated the slur that is repeated again and again by even educated men like him, that Indians got land. Indians didn't get squat. Part of the contract for Indian labor had a clause that they had to have the passage back to India paid. That passage was worth $60 for a trip back to India. It is an ironic fact that that clause was put in to return Africans who had been brought as liberated individuals from Liberia. And some of them did go back to Sierra Leone, for example. The first people who went back and used that facility was a ship that took Africans who had been brought as indentured, liberated Africans they were called, but they were indentured, and they went back to Africa. So this passage to India came out of a legislation from 1856, a passage back to Africa. It wasn't a special thing. It was put there to encourage Indians to come back, as it was put there to encourage Africans to come from Africa. So the point I want to make is that the $60 worth is what they had. So every Indian up to a particular year, because later the planters changed it, and those Indians had to begin to pay first a portion and later all of it to go back to India. But the point is that if you look, and there's been a study done and studies done, and I compiled the reports. Leslie Potter, who was at the University of Guyana in the 70s, maybe Kimani was there with our friend Freddie Kissoon at that time there. Leslie Marian Potter did a study of this, and she went to the land records, and she showed the kinds of lands Indians utilized. The first one was when they kept, the first thing, Indians were very conservative. They kept working on the plantations and rented nearby swampy land. Rented, they paid for it. The estate never gave any Indian land. They paid a rental, in many cases $5 per acre per crop. It wasn't given or lent or anything, it was rented. So that's the first kind of rice. After 1865, when 15 acres were tried at Leonora, at Edinburgh, where the field and track is now, the first 16 acres, the first acres was tried, and it was proven to be true, to be successful. Indians started to purchase land in small quantities, and these are recorded, because one good thing about the Dutch system, it is all recorded. Land in Guyana is one of the toughest things to mess around with. Unless it's in writing, you ain't owning no land, and that remains the rule for today. You could have a contract for anything, oral contract, not for land. So these are all oral contracts, and they are there on record as to the Indians purchasing this land. To encourage Indians for staying and not to pay that repatriation fund, we know the planters then started what was called these settlements. But as Beto pointed out, each of these settlements, the white man like to have their cake and eat it too. So Eustadarian was a failed settlement. The Indians did not take up their land. And why? They pointed out, buddy, you need a coker. The land is sandy, and you need a canal, and you need a coker to get that water out. They weren't going to be dumb, right? There was some land in my part of the country at Best Foreshore. In Shahabuddin's book about sugar, he talked about the Indian said, Shahabuddin used the word gelatinous land filled with water. Of course, the Indians had their own term of it, right? We could say abandon. The point is that in each case, whether it is Bushlot scheme, whether it is Helena, whether it is Wim, all these so-called settlements, go and check the record. It's a matter of in the book, or check Leslie Potter's book. It's on the web. It's a PhD thesis out of McGill University. 1977 thesis. It's on the web. It's all documented there. It is all land that was sold. Now, it could be that it was sold at the time it was sold after the 1890s. They reduced the price of land from $100 per acre to $5 per acre. But that was not as a concession to Indian. Gold was found in the interior, and they wanted to open up gold mining. So they dropped the price for crown land because to encourage gold mining. My grandfather, who was bound to, great-grandfather, bound to plantation de Willem, and his indentureship ended in 1893, then bought 25 acres at Canal Number 2 because he could afford it. He had saved this money during his indentureship. And 25 times 5, he could afford $125 in Canal Number 2. So if you look, Indians always bought land. Nothing was given to them. And we got to stop this. It's a running slur on Indians. And we have to say why, why they were successful. That's a whole other story. I want to come back to us having a responsibility as individuals who are educated to ask questions of ourselves. We talk of the post-colonial state after colonialism, which was inherited by Mr. Forbes Burnham. And we have on this panel the chairman of the Burnham Foundation, my good friend, Vincent Alexander. And I challenged individuals, and I was hoping that Vincent or some other person would have answered me. I put it in a column which the Stabroek News published as a letter a few weeks ago. And I said, Mr. Burnham tried to rectify each of the weaknesses that are being pointed out ad nauseum about the African condition. Give the man credit. He tried to rectify it. And what did he do? In the case of rice, where Indians had gone into rice on their own, nobody helped them. My grandfather had 2 bulls. My great-grandfather, we still know the name of those bulls, Sahadeo and Nakul, 2 names from the Mahabharata. He named his bulls. They were brave and fight, and they could plow that land. And he cleared up land at Canal Number 2, right? So the point is that Mr. Burnham, after he took over in 1964, between 64 and 68, when he still was with Mr. Peter Degar, the conservative Mr. Peter Degar, Mr. Burnham took on the empowerment of Africans in the rice industry by taking steps to curb what the Indians were, he said, were profiting from. So Mr. Burnham introduced a law where all paddy had to be sold to the state. And Mr. Burnham created these huge silos and these huge milling plants, which were created by African labor. So what, as J.E. Green, our present chancellor of the University of Guyana, put out in the paper is still there, published by UWI, which said that what Mr. Burnham did was to take the money for agriculture that the PNPP government had put still in agriculture, but use it to construct all these rice facilities that were run by Afro-Guyanese. So if you go to Burma, there was now, you use the paddy hucks to make electricity. So you had the managers who were all Afro-Guyanese living like managers back in the plantation. You got to go back to Burma and check all those houses. Go to where I live, not far from here. The same thing in Vietnam. The same thing up near Dartmouth, up where Kimani comes from, up by New Road there. I forget the name of the place where the females are. Even in Blackbush Polder, the section of Blackbush Polder which had been given to Indians, it was said, forget who the ICJ showed they were applied for by people who were farmers. He carved out a part from my Bikuri and gave it to African Guyanese farmers. In fact, it was known as Zambia it was called Zambia. So throughout the land, in Region 5, Mr. Burnham opened up over 58,000 acres of land and gave African Guyanese farmers more land than he gave to Indian farmers. Leased. Let me say gave. Leased. But ask ourselves, why did those African farmers lease the land to Indo farmers and by and large did not plant the acreage? Okay? So the point is, in rice, we can take sugar after he came back in 68. I'm not going to get to how he came back in 68. That's another story for another time. In 1968, the same year he came back, the Crane Commission had given profit sharing to the sugar workers, primarily Indians. And the Crane gave the formula. 60% of sugar is due to labor, 40% due to machinery. So the profit was to be shared 60% to the workers, 40% for rehabilitation of factories and profits. Those, Mr. Burnham introduced a levy in 1974, which wiped out all that profit. No profit was made until 1999, when Ravi Dev and others launched a union and the PPP was forced to abandon the levy and give out profit sharing. My father, for the first time, could buy furniture in the house where I live here in 1968 when he got, they call it once for all. Okay? We hear Kimani talking about Silwif funds. Silwif funds came out from a fund set up by bookers under the guidance of Lord Campbell, right? In 1947, some people say Jagan got it. Jagan didn't give sugar workers anything. Jagan, what they did, they put out a fund back in 47, and everybody who was working on the sugar estate got acreage, got land. I live in Iflut here, and in Iflut, Ocean View, the portion where I live, and I'm tracing the history of movement out of the Logis into here. My father came from that section of the Logis called Letter A, and we came to Ocean View. Was given a loan, not given money. He was given a loan, which in fact Jagan criticized, because over the course of a 20-year loan, he paid 10 times more than he was supposed to pay to the estate that was leasing that land for pennies. Yet he charged that. So if you go to the African section, which I go there almost weekly and talk to my friends who I went to school with, and they have nice houses that were built with Silwif fund. In fact, there's a section that we call Kashwa. There was a huge thing called the Garrison that was broken down, and it was made into cottages. And all of that is occupied by African Guyanese today. So don't say that the Silwif fund only Indians got. The African, in fact, were the superior workers. They were the factory workers. So when I talk about the Hyman, who was factory engineer, Mr. Hyman, who was factory engineer, when I talk about the Mounters, who Vincent, no, right? Strong PNC people in there. When I talk about all the families in my village of Iflut, the African section, they were basically factory workers who were earning bigger salaries than the workers. So we could talk about small trade where the Indians had used, as Thomas Sowell showed, their own capital of money, of time, and being in that shop. Mr. Burnham introduced the External Trade Bureau, which mandated that all imports must come through the ETB. And all the goods were now given to, not to these small shops, was given to something called Knowledge Sharing Institute. So you see in Iflut, for example, where I used to visit and come back, and every week, every year I would come back after 1979, right? The KSI was located in the African section of my village, where you had to go and line up for butter or whatever you wanted. And all Indian stores were destroyed. What was not destroyed was rum shops. We criticized the colonial masters for allowing rum shops to be outside of the the pay office. India never had distilled alcohol. We had a drink called mahua. You take a flower and it was a fermented drink. It gave you a slight high, like bhang that we had, ganja. You boil it with milk and you drink it, you get a little bit of a high. Distilled alcohol was introduced both in India and here by the British, make us into alcoholics, right? The point is this, that in every area of national endeavor, Mr. Burnham, right, nationalized sugar. Most of the factory managers, the hierarchy was all Afro-Guyanese. In my village of Iflut, a man named Mr. Downs, who would boast that he could call up directly to Mr. Burnham and speak to him. And when Dunstan Barrow, the chairman, daughter was married at Leonora Club, it was raining, and my brother who worked in the sugar estate in the factory could report to me that they use the fertilizer, the urea, to pour it on the road like snow, so the bride and groom could walk from the public road to the ocean where that guest house is, where Irfan now lives, probably in that guest house. You understand? So I could go on and on, but what I want to ask, that all of these things that Mr. Burnham did, however, for Afro-Guyanese, and by 1992, luckily for all of us, there was a household income and expenditure survey done. And what it showed in 1992, after all of that, and Indians were peripheralized. I don't have to tell you what my parents had to do to make a living. You get me? You mine fowl, you mine duck, you mine pig, you plant a little garden, you cook with something called sawdust. My brother had to go to the lock to get fish. You call it specking. The point is, though, you want to know, by 1992, these two groups were yet equal by the income and their expenditure. The question I'm posing, Vincent talks about the psychological aspects that we must question. I think this is crucial if we are to go forward, because this is no slight on anybody. Slavery and indentureship messed up our heads in many, many ways, right? And it's still there. And I still hear people on these Black activist shows, one of them for my friend who I will not mention his name, entertains a lady who calls in, and every single show talks about coolie people being dragged from the slums of India. Only the first 5 years, people were brought from around Calcutta. After that, it shifted to the villages, which the British had destroyed the whole economy of North India. Rather than plant the food that sustained us, we had to plant poppy, right? My great-grandfather had to plant poppy to get opium, so the opium could sell to the Chinese to get tea. The biggest drug dealers in the world were facilitated by that. So after destroying all of the industries of North India, right, the villages had to be, the people had to seek work. It is not slums they came from. It is villages that were vibrant. They cut out, the British cut out the thumb from individuals who used to weave cotton. So India became the importer of cotton rather than the exporter of cotton to the rest of the world. What I want to say is that we got to stop these misstatement of facts. Let us deal with facts and say why it happened, right? I conclude by a personal statement. Beto brought up the fact of Maharani. My wife right now is engaged in seeking to find out her great Aji, right? The mother of her grandfather, Abdul Rahim. She was a Brahmin woman who came on that same ship, the Alan Shaw of 1885 with Maharani. She saw that rape of Maharani. There was an inquiry into that. But in 1929, that woman decided to return to India, one of the quarter of Indians who decided to return. She went on the ship Sutlej, 425 people from Jamaica, 20 from Trinidad, and 520 from Guyana went back on the Sutlej. We don't know if she arrived. 47 persons died. She was around 70 years old, and she's trying to find out. This is a personal story of an individual who came, and we have an account of what she did to raise that son, Abdul Rahim, right? Who became a successful man, right? So I want to say all of this, that we must be factual. And if we are individuals who are educated, and if we're going to repeat these lies about people being dragged from the slums, people being given land, people being pampered, where is it going to take us? As Beto said, all it's going to do is divide us further, and we will be just as complicit as the British, who divided and ruled us for over 200 years. Thank you, Vishnu.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid it's now 9:31.
I
Ask for a final minute. Kimani, take it one. Let's close.
All right, thanks. Ravi, did I say Indians were given land in the sense that it was free?
No, you said given. You used the word given.
All right. If for any reason what I said could have been misrepresented, I apologize. That's not me.
Very
right?
good.
So it doesn't have to be that I misuse the word. Once it could have been accepted as a misuse, I apologize. No,
Just like slavery. I wouldn't use slavery anymore.
I hear you. But you just did. Next thing, I said on some of these talks that it's important for us to understand the destruction of African identity. And I think Ravi hinted at it, and Vincent hinted at it also when you all talk about the psychology in the mind. You see, and I don't think most of us understand how destructive that has been. And this is where I engage with Betaram's piece that I think you flung it at me, that the whole thing about George Lamming and the hands that fed were Indian hands and so on, and what happened with Guyana during Barnum's reign. You didn't say that, but you said from 1966 to some time. Now, very often we describe aspects of reality without putting them in the larger context. And while sometimes we might be accurate to say this happened and that didn't happen, the question is why? And I go back to something I said before. We need to understand the world before Europeans intervened. And if we don't, we could misconstrue some of the things we see, some of the facts on the ground. So why did Barnum's rule end up as it did? I don't think Barnum was trying to run the country only for African people. I wasn't where's the word? I wasn't an uncritical supporter of Barnum. In fact, it's got me into trouble, and I'm still in trouble with some people. But that's another story. Why were Africans, who were the first farmers in the world, not able to farm the land that was leased to them, that Ravi mentioned? We have a lot of whys. The reason some of these things happen is that African people were so deprived of some of the values and attitudes, the skills that are intergenerational, that they couldn't do anything. And this is why you see Mr. Barnum and other people giving African people things, and they can't use them. Not effectively, because of the destruction of identity. They don't always know what's right or what's wrong for them. So this question of the colonial state under Barnum returns us to the argument I was making before. If you don't give back to African Guyanese people our identity, you could come back 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, and you're going to find much of the same situations. So identity is critical, and it means returning history and culture. And that's one of the ways in which a state could do something for African Guyanese people, and indeed for all Guyanese people. Last word on this. I was one of the people who started
forward, and let's have continue this discussion in a couple of weeks from now.
All right, let me just say this. I was one of the people who started the reparations, the current reparations upsurge, if I might put it that way. And one of the things we were certain about from the inception is this question of what Vincent called self-reparations, returning us to ourselves. You can't beat that. That's the most fundamental thing that could happen. Are people in charge of themselves are going to be efficient or more efficient in what they do with what's given to them. And I think Indian people in Guyana demonstrate that compared to African Guyanese people. And we have to make these comparisons, not because we want to be gloating or something. That we need to educate ourselves. We need to see what is working and what is not working and why. So, Veteran, I hope that I answer you at least in part. But we need to continue these discussions because there's a lot that need to be fleshed out. Like $60 at one point in time. How much money was that? It wasn't a little set of money. So these are issues that we need to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, after this, I need a shot of bushrum. I have to let you guys know.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we'll have to continue this some other time. Otherwise, we'll be here till tomorrow morning. But
I won't mind that one.
That's good. That's good.
Great discussion. I myself learned so much about enslaved people as well, and I like this concept of two terms of internal reparation and external reparations from Vincent as well. Look, thank you all, gentlemen. We'll meet again soon. Best wishes. Good night. Thank you all for joining in and viewing and watching and listening to us here tonight on Globespan 24/7. Thank you. Good night.
All over this country, she is